In the early 2000s, before Joaquin El Chapo Guzman became a global headline and his name was spoken in courtrooms across continents, power in Sinaloa operated under quieter rules. Power was measured by who stayed silent, who listened more than they spoke, and who understood that loyalty was not declared with words but proven through time. If you enjoy deep stories like this, stories inspired by real people, real fear, and the moments history never fully explains, we have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Subscribe, leave a like, and become part of this journey. Back then, men didn't chase fame. They chased survival, and even that came at a price. El Chapo sat at the center of this world, not as a loud tyrant, but as a patient observer who believed that men always revealed themselves eventually. On a humid night in Culiacan, inside a low-profile cantina with no sign outside and no cameras inside, El Chapo occupied his usual seat, his back to the wall, his eyes moving slowly across the room. The music was low, the drink steady, the conversations carefully controlled. Across from him sat Hector Rivas, known among insiders as El Ingeniero, a man whose value came not from violence but from intelligence. Hector understood routes, timing, tunnels, and logistics, the invisible architecture that kept an empire alive. He had been there during the early expansion, when mistakes were punished harshly and loyalty was the only shield. He smiled easily, spoke calmly, and never rushed his words. Men like that survived longer than most. Men like that were also the hardest to read. El Chapo trusted very few people, but Hector had earned something close to trust through years of consistency. He never arrived late, never asked unnecessary questions, never tried to stand out. He knew when to speak, and, more importantly, when not to. That night, however, El Chapo felt something subtle shift in the air. Nothing obvious. No sudden tension. Just a faint sense that something was missing, like a familiar sound that had stopped without warning. Hector laughed at the right moments, but his eyes lingered too long on the door. His hand rested on his glass, as if grounding himself. El Chapo noticed these things. He always did. In his world, intuition was not superstition. It was experience refined by survival. When the meeting ended, there were no raised voices, no threats, no visible conflict. Men stood, shook hands, and disappeared into the darkness of the street, as they had done countless times before. But as El Chapo stepped outside and felt the night air settle on his skin, he paused. He turned back toward the cantina, replaying the evening in his mind. Hector's smile, his silence, his hesitation. El Chapo said nothing to his guards. He simply got into the vehicle and left. Somewhere deep in his instincts, a name had been quietly marked. El Chapo did not yet know how, when, or where the consequences would unfold, but he understood one thing clearly. When a man who knows everything begins to look for exits, it is only a matter of time before he chooses one. Hector Rivas did not disappear in a single night. Men like him never did. Disappearing was a process, a sequence of small decisions that look harmless when viewed alone, but became irreversible when combined. First, a trusted courier was reassigned. Then a bank account in Mexico went dormant while another, offshore, quietly grew. Hector blamed stress, pressure, the tightening grip of international law enforcement. He told himself he was being cautious, not disloyal. In his mind, survival and betrayal were separated by a thin, convenient line. He convinced himself he was still loyal in spirit, even as his actions drifted further from the center. Within weeks of that night in the cantina, Hector began planting excuses. An ill relative in Veracruz, a business opportunity requiring travel, meetings postponed, calls returned later than usual. None of it was dramatic enough to raise alarms, but El Chapo noticed the absence the same way one notices a missing tooth with the tongue, instinctively, repeatedly. Still, no orders were given, no questions asked. In El Chapo's world, rushing to confront uncertainty often created more danger than waiting. Silence, again, became the test. When Hector finally vanished, it was almost disappointing in its simplicity. No gunfire, no burned vehicles, no bodies, just an empty house, cleared accounts, and a trail that dissolved into international paperwork and false names. Among the men, rumors exploded immediately. Some whispered that Hector had been arrested and was already talking. Others insisted he had been executed quietly and buried far from roads. A few suggested something more unsettling, that El Chapo had allowed him to leave. That theory didn't survive long. No one was allowed to leave once they knew that much. Not unless they were already dead. El Chapo said nothing. Days passed, then weeks. His silence disturbed even his closest lieutenants. They had seen his anger before, swift, decisive, unforgettable. This was different. This was restraint. It was as if Hector's disappearance had not triggered rage, but calculation. El Chapo understood something most men didn't. Immediate punishment satisfied emotion, but delayed consequences reshaped behavior. Whoever Hector had become, wherever he had gone, El Chapo wanted him comfortable first. Fear was more effective when it arrived late. Hector, meanwhile, believed he had escaped history. Spain became his first refuge, then Italy. He learned new routines, new accents, new ways of walking into rooms without attracting attention. At first, every siren made his heart race. Every stranger felt like a shadow. But months turned into years. Nothing happened. No messages. No warnings. No retaliation. Slowly, the fear that had driven him away transformed into confidence. He began to believe the past had lost its scent. What Hector never understood was that El Chapo was not hunting him. He was waiting for him to stop running. Time changed Hector Rivas, but it did not erase him. 11 years passed, and with each one, the fear that once ruled his decisions softened into something more dangerous. Comfort. He lived under different names, but the habits of his old life refused to die. He still preferred corner tables, still measured rooms by exits, still avoided photographs. Yet he allowed himself small indulgences, just enough to feel human again. A better apartment, expensive wine, dinners that lasted longer than necessary. Survival, he decided, was proof that he had made the right choice. What Hector never saw was how quietly El Chapo adapted. Even as arrests, escapes, and betrayals reshaped the cartel landscape, El Chapo maintained something like a personal archive, names that were never spoken aloud but never forgotten. Hector's name remained there, untouched, not crossed out, not avenged. El Chapo did not see him as an enemy in the traditional sense. He saw him as unfinished business. Betrayal, to El Chapo, was not an emotional wound. It was a structural failure that required correction. From prison, and through intermediaries, El Chapo continued to receive fragments of information. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. A financial transaction that felt familiar. A logistics concept recycled under a different company name. A man in Europe who spoke about tunnels, as if they were memories, not ideas. These fragments alone meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. El Chapo recognized patterns the way others recognize faces. The confirmation arrived quietly. A message passed through multiple hands, stripped of emotion and detail, until it became almost meaningless. An old engineer drinks Barolo on Thursdays. Rome. El Chapo did not ask questions. He did not celebrate. He simply nodded. The past, it seemed, had finally grown tired of hiding. The plan was deliberately simple. No soldiers, no threats, no public reckoning. El Chapo understood that spectacle diluted power. He wanted Hector to see him, to recognize him, and to understand that time had never been a shield. A quiet restaurant was chosen, elegant enough to feel safe, neutral enough to avoid suspicion. A reservation was made under a name that meant nothing to anyone else. Table 7. Hector received the invitation through a business associate who believed he was arranging a routine meeting. Potential investment. Private conversation. Good wine. Hector hesitated only briefly. 11 years without consequence had trained him to trust normality again. He agreed, unaware that comfort had been the final mistake. History does not rush. It waits until the moment its lesson can no longer be ignored. The restaurant in Rome was the kind of place people chose when they wanted to feel untouchable. Soft lighting, muted conversations, polished wood, and the quiet confidence of a room that believed nothing truly dangerous could happen inside it. Table 7 sat slightly apart from the others, close enough to be visible, far enough to feel private. Hector arrived early, as he always did. Old habits survived even when identities changed. He adjusted his jacket, scanned the room without moving his head, and ordered wine he could barely taste. The years had taught him how to look calm while his body stayed alert. When El Chapo entered, no one turned to look. There was no drama in his arrival, no entourage, no signal that history had just stepped through the door. He moved like a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Hector noticed him only when the chair across from him slid back. He looked up instinctively, and the world narrowed to a single point. 11 years collapsed into one frozen second. The room did not spin. His heart did not race. Something worse happened. Everything inside him went completely still. Neither man spoke at first. Silence filled the space between them, thick and deliberate. El Chapo studied Hector the way one studies an old structure, familiar, altered, still recognizable beneath the surface. Hector searched for words that refused to come. His mouth opened, then closed again. He realized too late that apologies were useless here. El Chapo did not come for explanations. He had come for acknowledgement. They spoke about neutral things. The wine, Europe, how time had changed the world. Each sentence felt like a test. Each pause carried weight. El Chapo's voice remained calm, almost gentle, which only deepened the tension. Hector felt exposed in a way he had never experienced, not threatened, not cornered, but seen. Completely. He understood then that survival had only postponed this moment, not erased it. El Chapo's hand moved slowly beneath the table. There was no rush, no aggression. When the gun appeared, it was not raised. It was simply placed on the table, resting between the breadbasket and the wine glasses, as casually as a phone. No one screamed. No one noticed. El Chapo did not look at the weapon. He looked only at Hector. Table 7, he said softly, almost conversationally, was never chosen by accident. In that moment, Hector understood that this meeting was not about death. It was about memory. And memory, he realized too late, was something he could never escape. Hector broke without being asked to. The gun stayed where it was, untouched, but its presence transformed the space around it. His hands began to shake, first subtly, then uncontrollably, as if his body had finally accepted what his mind had denied for 11 years. Words poured out in fragments, names, dates, numbers, confessions tangled with excuses. He spoke of fear, of pressure, of family, of the belief that disappearing was the only way to stay alive. He tried to explain how betrayal had felt less like a choice and more like a slow drift. El Chapo listened without interrupting, without changing his expression. This was not an interrogation. It was a release. "You didn't run," El Chapo said quietly, his voice steady. "You reorganized your life without us." The sentence landed harder than any threat. Hector understood then that El Chapo had never viewed his actions as panic. They had been calculated, rational, cold. That realization stripped away the last layer of self-justification he had clung to for years. He lowered his eyes, not in shame, but in defeat. There was nothing left to negotiate. El Chapo leaned back slightly, finally glancing at the gun, then back at Hector. "Killing you would be easy," he continued. "Easy things are forgotten." He reached forward, closed his fingers around the weapon, and slid it back beneath the table, out of sight. The tension did not leave with it. If anything, it deepened. Hector realized he was being spared, but not forgiven. In that moment, survival became a punishment. The check arrived. El Chapo paid, without looking at the total. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and placed a hand briefly on Hector's shoulder. Not a gesture of comfort, but of ownership. "You'll live," he said, "just not the way you planned." Then he walked away, disappearing into the restaurant's quiet elegance, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No raised voices, no blood, just an ending disguised as mercy. Within weeks, Hector felt the consequences unfold. Accounts frozen, offshore funds emptied through mechanisms too precise to trace. Business partners stopped answering calls. Documents failed. Passports raised alarms. The infrastructure he had built to protect himself collapsed silently, piece by piece. He was left alive, broke, and exposed, With no enemy to fight and no system to blame, El Chapo had not taken his life. He had taken his future, and that, Hector would soon learn, lasted much longer. Hector Rivas did not collapse immediately. Men like him rarely did. At first, he believed the financial chaos was temporary. A technical error, a delay, a coincidence layered too neatly to be random. He made calls, sent messages, waited. Days passed, then weeks. The silence that answered him felt heavier than any threat he had ever faced. What El Chapo had done was not destruction. It was erasure. Hector was being removed from the systems that had once protected him, as if he had never truly existed within them. The fear returned, sharper than before, because this time it came without direction. There was no enemy to outrun, no authority to negotiate with, no shadow to confront. Hector moved cities, then countries, abandoning apartments overnight, sleeping in places that never felt temporary enough. He stopped using his own voice on the phone. He paid in cash when he could. When he couldn't, he simply went without. Survival stripped itself down to instinct again, but this time without ambition, without hope of rebuilding. He understood now that El Chapo had left him alive, so that fear could mature inside him. News from Mexico reached him in fragments. Arrests, escapes, trials. El Chapo's name growing heavier. With each headline, to the world, El Chapo was becoming a symbol, a kingpin, a criminal, a myth. To Hector, he remained something far more personal, a reminder that time did not weaken memory, it sharpened it. Every night, Hector replayed the moment at table 7, the calm voice, the untouched gun. He realized that was the real punishment. El Chapo had not needed to pull the trigger. The possibility was enough. Meanwhile, within the cartel's inner circles, the story spread quietly. No details, no location, just the outcome. A man who vanished for 11 years had been found, and had not died. That alone terrified people more than any execution ever could. It reminded them that betrayal did not expire, that patience could be deadlier than rage. Loyalty, once again, became less about devotion and more about fear of being remembered. Hector lived, but as a shadow of himself. He avoided restaurants entirely. He never sat at tables with numbers. When forced to eat in public, he chose standing bars, quick exits, places where no one stayed long enough to be seen. Yet no matter where he went, the same thought followed him relentlessly. El Chapo had not ended his life because he wanted Hector to carry it. Fully aware, fully awake, and permanently afraid. And that realization settled into Hector's bones as the truest sentence he had learned in 11 years of running. Some guns never need to fire to finish the job. Years later, El Chapo would sit in a prison cell thousands of miles from Rome, his name now carved permanently into global history. Courts describe him with numbers, sentences, counts, years. Journalists reduced his life to headlines and escape stories. Government spoke of him as a victory finally secured. But none of them understood how power had truly worked around him. Power was never only about territory or money. It was about messages delivered quietly, without witnesses, in moments no camera would ever record. Inside the prison, El Chapo spoke rarely about the past. When he did, it was never with nostalgia or regret. Other inmates told stories loudly, exaggerating their violence, inflating their reputations. El Chapo listened, the same way he always had. Once, when a younger inmate asked how he survived so long with so many enemies, El Chapo answered without looking up. Because fear listens, he said. Violence just makes noise. The inmate laughed, thinking it was a joke. The men who had lived longer did not. Hector Rivas followed the trial obsessively from whatever temporary shelter he could afford at the time. He watched El Chapo grow older behind glass, his face calm, his posture unchanged. The sight offered no relief. If anything, it deepened the weight Hector carried. El Chapo did not look like a defeated man. He looked finished, complete. Hector understood then that Table 7 had been El Chapo's closure, not his revenge. The story had ended there, quietly, exactly the way El Chapo wanted it to. Among those who still operated in the shadows, the lesson endured. No one spoke Hector's name openly, but everyone knew it. A man who betrayed. A man who vanished. A man who was found and left alive. That outcome reshaped behavior more effectively than mass graves ever had. It taught patience. It taught restraint. Above all, it taught that memory was the longest weapon El Chapo ever wielded, and it reached far beyond prison walls. Hector Rivas grew old without growing free. Age arrived quietly, bringing fatigue instead of peace. His hair thinned. His hands lost their steadiness, and his reflection became someone he barely recognized. But fear never aged with him. It stayed sharp, alert, present. He moved through Europe like a man permanently late for something he could never reach. Jobs came and went. Names changed. Faces blurred. Yet one image never faded. The polished surface of Table 7, the wine glasses catching light, and the gun resting calmly between them like an idea that could not be undone. Some nights, Hector dreamed that El Chapo had killed him in that restaurant. In those dreams, death felt almost kind. He would wake up disappointed, his heart racing, his body soaked in sweat, realizing that the punishment was not over. Living had become the sentence. Survival, once his greatest victory, had turned into a slow, relentless reminder that escape was never the same as absolution. The restaurant in Rome continued operating long after that night. New customers sat at Table 7, laughing, celebrating, unaware that history had passed through their space without leaving a mark. The staff changed. The decor evolved. Only the table remained, cleaned and reused endlessly, carrying no visible trace of what had happened there. But places remember even when people don't. Power, when exercised quietly, leaves echoes instead of evidence. El Chapo would spend the rest of his life behind concrete and steel, spoken of as a legend, a criminal, a symbol of an era that governments claimed to have ended. Yet his most effective act of power had required no armies, no bloodshed, no spectacle. It had required only patience, timing, and the certainty that some lessons were better delivered softly. Those who understood that never needed explanations. And so the story of Table 7 never appeared in court records or headlines. It lived where the most important stories always live, in silence, in memory, and in the choices men make when they believe time has protected them. Because in El Chapo's world, the past did not chase you. It waited, and when it finally sat across from you, it never needed to raise its voice.